Hello, and welcome to Paint the Past. I'm your host, Amaris. Today, I'm painting a fossil. At first glance, it probably looks like ferns or flowers, but what you're actually looking at is the remains of animals, very old animals, called crinoids. And once I tell you a bit about what these things actually were, I think you'll find them just as fascinating as I do. So, let's talk about crinoids. The reference photo I'm using was taken by Sanjay Acharya at the Smithsonian and is available on Wikimedia Commons. I'll link it below the video. The name crinoid comes from the Greek word krinon, meaning lily, and they're often called sea lilies, which is honestly a pretty fitting name. They look exactly like underwater flowers, with long, flexible stalks anchored to the seafloor and a crown of feathery arms fanning out at the top. Beautiful and elegant, and completely alien looking when you realize that they're not plants. They're animals, marine animals belonging to a group called Echinodermata, the same group as starfish, sea urchins, sea cucumbers, and brittle stars. That's their extended family. So when you look at this fossil, you're looking at a distant cousin of a starfish that happened to live a very, very different lifestyle. The body plan of a crinoid has three main parts. At the bottom, you have the holdfast, or root. That's what anchors the animal to the substrate, whether it was a rock or sediment, or sometimes even a shell or piece of wood floating in the water column. From there, a long, flexible stalk extends upward, made of stacked disc-shaped segments, called columnals. And then, at the very top, is the calyx. It's the cup-shaped structure that houses the animal's actual body, with arms radiating out from it, sometimes branching repeatedly into fine, feathery fronds called pinnules. Those arms weren't just for show. They're covered in tiny tube feet, coated in mucus, and the crinoid uses them to filter plankton and organic particles out of the water as they drift past. The food gets trapped on the tube feet, wrapped up in the mucus, and then transported along a groove on the arms down to the mouth, which is on top of the calyx, facing upward. It's filter feeding, but extraordinarily graceful filter feeding. Now, some crinoids, especially modern ones, don't have a stalk at all. These free-swimming forms are called feather stars, and they can actually crawl along the seafloor and even swim by flapping their arms in a coordinated rhythm. Watching a video of them move is one of those things that makes you remember how wonderfully strange life on Earth really is. The mind-bending part about crinoids is how ancient they are, like really, truly ancient, in a way that's difficult for the human mind to wrap around. The earliest accepted crinoid fossils appear in the Ordovician period, roughly 485 million years ago. For reference, the dinosaurs didn't show up until about 230 million years ago. Crinoids predate the dinosaurs by more than 250 million years. They were already an old, established, and diverse group of animals by the time the first land plants were even figuring out how to grow roots. During the Paleozoic era, particularly the Silurian, Devonian, and Mississippian periods, crinoids absolutely dominated the shallow seafloors. There were meadows of them, forests of them. In some places, they were so abundant that their skeletal debris accumulated in layers, hundreds of feet or about 100 meters thick, becoming what we now call crinoidal limestone. The cliff faces of many parts of the American Midwest, England, and Europe are built from the compressed remains of countless billions of these animals. They're literally part of the landscape. The Mississippian period, which ran from about 359 to 323 million years ago, is sometimes actually called the Age of Crinoids, because that's just how dominant they were during that interval. If you walk into the right road cut in Indiana or Illinois, You can see the evidence right there in the rock face. Layers of fossil debris, mostly crinoid parts, just stacked up like geological wallpaper. And then, about 252 million years ago, came the end Permian mass extinction, the worst mass extinction in the history of complex life on Earth. Something, likely a combination of massive volcanic activity in Siberia, a runaway greenhouse effect, ocean acidification, and oxygen depletion in the seas, killed off something like 90 to 96% of all marine species. Nearly all crinoid groups were entirely wiped out. Thousands of species gone. But not quite all of them. One lineage, just one as far as the fossil record shows, survived. And from that single surviving group, a whole new radiation of crinoids slowly spread back out across the world's oceans in the following tens of millions of years. The crinoids alive today are their descendants, roughly about 700 known species currently, most of them feather stars, living in tropical and subtropical waters. The stalked sea lilies, the kind that look most like their Paleozoic ancestors, tend to live much deeper, often below 200 meters, where they're rarely seen by anyone who isn't specifically looking for them. So when you hold a crinoid fossil in your hand, you're holding the remains of an animal from a lineage that survived the worst catastrophe in the history of animal life. That's not nothing. Most crinoid fossils you'll encounter are not what you'll see in natural history museum displays. Those fully articulated, gorgeous specimens with every arm and every pinnule preserved, like those that I'm painting. Those are exceptionally rare, and they're rare for a reason. The crinoid skeleton is made of calcite, which is calcium carbonate, and it's not one solid piece. It's made up of hundreds or sometimes thousands of individual plates, all held together in life by muscles, nerves, and soft tissue. The moment a crinoid dies, those soft tissues start to decompose and the skeleton falls apart, usually within days, sometimes just hours. The result is that most of what you'll find in the fossil record are just the stem ossicles, those individual disc-shaped segments, the ones that look like little wagon wheels with a hole in the center. Loose, scattered, and everywhere. They're called columnals, and they're one of the most common fossils in the world. In parts of the Midwest US, you can find them in gravel driveways. For a whole crinoid to be preserved, with arms, calyx, stalk, and everything together, it generally needs to be buried rapidly, before the skeleton can disarticulate. The best mechanism for this is a sudden sediment dump, a storm, a turbidity current, or like a mudslide on the sea floor. Something that catches an entire community of living animals and buries them fast enough that the soft tissue doesn't have time to decay. The famous Crinoid site at Crawfordsville, Indiana, which has produced more than 200 described species from Mississippian-age rock about 340 million years old, is thought to have been preserved by exactly this kind of event. Rapid burial by submarine mud flows that froze the entire communities of feeding crinoids in place. The result is some of the most stunning invertebrate fossils in the world, with animals captured essentially in their living posture, arms still spread, as if they were just paused mid-meal. The fossils I'm painting are from a similar time period, but they're from Iowa. Here's something I love about crinoids. Humans have been finding them and being fascinated by them for a very long time, long before we had any idea what they actually were. Because the stem segments, those little disc-shaped ossicles, are so common, so perfectly shaped, and, crucially, already have a hole through the center. People throughout history have used them as beads, and I mean throughout history. In Bronze Age Europe, Crinoid columnals were commonly used as beads and strung together as jewelry. In medieval England, they were found washing up on beaches along the North Sea coast, particularly in Northumberland, and they became associated with Saint Cuthbert, a beloved 7th century monk from the island of Lindisfarne. According to legend, Cuthbert himself would sit on the rocks at night and thread the tiny fossil discs into rosary beads. The fossils became known as St. Cuthbert's beads. Sir Walter Scott even referenced them in his 1808 narrative poem, Marmion. In other parts of England, round columnals were known as fairy money. Pentagonal ones, because some crinoid stems have 5-sided ossicles, were called starstones. In Germany, they were called Bonifacius Pfennige, or St. Boniface's pennies. In America, they were long called Indian beads. Same fossil, different stories, all over the world. People couldn't explain what they were, so they wove them into stories that made sense to them, which is honestly a very human thing to do. It wasn't until the 16th and 17th centuries that naturalists started seriously grappling with the true nature of fossils, and even then, crinoids were puzzling. The stems looked like plants. The columnals looked like beads or coins. It took a while to sort out. I want to tell you about the rather charming story of how one of the most impressive crinoid fossil collections in the world came to exist. Like many of the most heartwarming stories in natural history, it involves a couple of obsessed amateurs. In the 1850s, a German immigrant named Charles Wachsmuth arrived in Burlington, Iowa. He had been trained as a lawyer back in Hanover, but had given it up due to poor health. He settled in Burlington and set himself up as a grocer. And then, wandering the limestone cliffs near his home along the Mississippi River, he discovered crinoid fossils, and he became obsessed. Burlington, Iowa sits on some of the richest Mississippian-age crinoidal limestone in the world. The first crinoid species described west of the Mississippi River were collected there, and the Burlington Formation eventually became known as one of the premier crinoid fossil localities on the continent. Wachsmuth didn't know any of that when he started. He just found the fossils, couldn't stop thinking about them, and kept collecting. He turned his business over to his wife so he could devote his full time to the fossils. He met the great naturalist Louis Agassiz in 1864 and traveled to Europe the following year to study crinoid fossils in the British Museum and other major collections. He came home inspired, built a private fireproof museum at the back of his house on Marietta Street to hold the collection, and just kept going. Then, in 1869, a young lawyer named Frank Springer arrived in Burlington to practice law. Springer had studied natural history at the University of Iowa before deciding that law was more practical. But the fossils in Burlington reignited something in him. He fell in with Wachsmuth, and the two of them became partners and close friends, spending their evenings and weekends collecting, preparing, and studying crinoids together. In 1873, Springer moved his law practice to New Mexico, which was still a territory at the time, but he kept coming back to Burlington every summer. The two men continued collaborating across the distance, writing letters, exchanging specimens, and co-authoring a series of scientific papers that transformed the field of crinoid paleontology. They identified new species, revised the classification of entire groups, worked out evolutionary relationships, and built one of the most important fossil collections in the world. Together, Wachsmuth and Springer amassed a collection of over 100,000 individual crinoid specimens. Think about it, 100,000 specimens, collected by two men, a grocer and a frontier lawyer, working in their spare time out of a private home in Iowa. In 1872, Agassiz visited Burlington again and saw how the collection had grown and purchased it for $6,000, a very substantial sum at the time, for Harvard's Museum of Comparative Zoology. He hired Vauxmouth to oversee Harvard's entire crinoid collection. But after Agassiz's death, funding dried up, and Vauxmouth returned to Burlington and simply started collecting all over again. The culmination of their work, a massive 2-volume monograph titled Revision of the Paleocrinoidea, and then the monograph of the North American Crinoidea camerata, was published posthumously in 1897, a year after Vauxmouth's death. Springer continued publishing important papers on crinoids until his own death in 1927. The Vauxmouth-Springer collection eventually made its way to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., where it remains one of the foundational collections of invertebrate paleontology. What I find so endearing about this story is how gloriously impractical their passion was. 2 lawyers, one of them running a grocery store to pay the bills, spending decades building a body of scientific work that became foundational to an entire field of paleontology, because they loved these little fossils, because the rocks along the Mississippi River were full of something beautiful and strange, and they just couldn't leave it alone. That's the thing about fossils. They have a way of getting under your skin. If you ever go hiking somewhere with exposed limestone, especially in the American Midwest or the British Isles, keep an eye out for little disc-shaped fossils with a hole in the center. There's a decent chance you've just found a piece of a crinoid. Now, I think the reference photo I've used is absolutely gorgeous, but I'm not thrilled with my resulting artwork. You can tell I'm having a bad time with a painting when the pencils come out. But hey, this is real life, and they can't all turn out well. And here's my hot take for the watercolorists out there. I don't like Arches paper. The blocks don't have enough adhesive on them, and the paper smells like cat food when it's wet. I had hoarded some because it's supposedly the good stuff, and now that I'm using it, I cannot wait for it to be gone. Anyway, I appreciate you joining me on this deep dive to meet the sea lilies and feather stars. If you've enjoyed it, I hope you'll join me next week for another episode. As always, I welcome recommendations for cool artifacts with interesting stories. This one was a viewer suggestion. See you next time!